Live in Corporate is brought to you by Doximity. Doximity is committed to fostering an inclusive and diverse work environment where differences are valued, practices are equitable, and employees experience a sense of belonging that allows them to bring their full, authentic selves daily. As medicine's largest network, there's an elevated level of responsibility to everything we do. We don't take that responsibility lightly and are committed to working towards a more equitable world inside and beyond our virtual office walls. So if you want to learn more about Doximity, go to your app store and type in DOXIMITY. Again, that's DOXIMITY. What's up, y'all? It's Zach. We live in corporate and we are back. Now listen, if you're listening to this, straight up, if you're listening to this, you're listening to the parent of a newborn. Okay. Now look, y'all remember probably about 2 years ago, I was excited. You know what I'm saying? We had just brought Emery into the world. Really, Candace brought Emery into the world. But man, this newborn situation, having a newborn and a 2-year-old, sheesh, I don't know. Listen, I raised my hand like 11 in Hunger Games. I'm with y'all in solidarity to all of my COVID pandemic parents. That's right, pandemic is still going on. So you're listening to someone who is not just tired, and I don't want to, it's easy to say you're tired, but there's this odd combination, y'all, I have of just exhaustion and hope and gratitude right now, right? Like, seeing this newborn, seeing Amon, Sinclair Nunn. Amon means faith, Sinclair means pure, and then Nunn, I don't know. It's my colonizer last name. You know what I'm saying? I don't know. But really thankful for this new life and our family expanding. I'm really thankful for new opportunities. I'm thankful for Living Corporate continuing to grow and expand. And I continue to be thankful for the guests that we were able to bring on to Living Corporate. The latest one we have for you this week is Dana Brownlee. Listen, Dana Brownlee is a lot of different things, okay? She's a Forbes senior contributor. She is a foremost expert speaker on the matter, topics around anti-racism, leadership, organizational effectiveness. I have been so excited to get Miss Brownlee on Living Corporate for some years now. And I say years as if Living Corporate's been around for decades. Living Corporate's been around a little over 4 years. So yes, since Living Corporate has started, I've been looking to try to get Miss Brownlee on the show. And it's just a great time. We talk about anti-racism. We talk about the difference in anti-racism and what is commonly described as DEI work and the points of difference there. And we talk about really what anti-racism looks like practically in the workplace. And, because that term is thrown around a lot, but like, what does it actually really mean organizationally? What does it mean behaviorally? Like, what does it actually mean? And so I'm excited to bring this conversation to y'all. Okay. Now, before we get to that conversation, we're going to pivot over. All right. Little bit of workplace democracy. All right. Shout out to our new segment. A little bit of some other announcements we got. A little bit of in-house ads. We do ads. We don't do ads like everybody else be doing ads. Like y'all be doing McDonald's and stuff like that. Like, nah, we be having. It's just different over here. So, make sure and enjoy the next segment. The next thing you're gonna hear after that is gonna be my conversation with Dana Brownlee. Talk to y'all soon. When you're building a culture of belonging, every word counts. That's why Textio brings the world's most advanced language insights into your hiring and employer brand content. Our industry-leading approach to artificial intelligence and machine learning provides the tools needed to find more diverse candidates. In short, Textio builds more equitable workspaces, guiding businesses and writing more inclusive job posts. And we're building on that success by bringing even more products to the market for all people who share our belief that language matters. Words have power, and at Textio, we harness that power to increase the access and availability of value-driven work for everyone. Living Corporate is brought to you by Doximity. Doximity helps over 2 million medical professionals. We are the largest medical network that includes over 80% of physicians and over 50% of physician assistants and nurse practitioners. We don't take that responsibility lightly and committed to working towards a more equitable world inside and beyond our virtual office walls. If you want to learn more about Doximity, check out your app store at DOXIMITY. That's DOXIMITY.
Welcome back to the Workplace Democracy Podcast segment brought to you by the Living Corporate Network. I'm your host, Ty Robinson, an attorney licensed to practice law in the state of Maryland. Thanks so much for tuning in again to the podcast segment that informs you about strategies to protect your rights as a professional employee. During this segment, we're going to talk about prison labor and the 13th Amendment exception. This is a somewhat different segment because we'll talk about some history around a law related to employment, but not in a typical context. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery and involuntary servitude in 1865, but the amendment had an exception to allow for slavery if it was for punishment of a crime. So to this day, many incarcerated people work for minuscule wages in order to pay for exorbitant phone calls or video calls home and pay for daily items from the commissary. Incarcerated people in some states aren't paid at all. No one should be forced to work for free. Read more about this issue through the links in the show notes. Please understand this podcast segment is only intended for educational purposes and is not a replacement for individualized legal advice. You should always seek the services of a licensed attorney who will look at the specific facts of your individual circumstance if you are contemplating legal action. Additionally, the views expressed in this podcast are my own and are not reflective of my employer.
Dana Brownlee. First of all, let me just say before you even say a thing, okay, I am so excited to have this conversation. I've been wanting to have you on Living Corporate now for legitimately 3 years. And
oh my goodness, thank you so much.
No, it's honestly, it's an honor to have you. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. How about you?
I'm doing well. So look, let's talk about this, right? People call it the summer of George Floyd. 2 years ago, George Floyd was murdered in the street on camera, and we saw this like renaissance of like white empathy towards black lives, and like being black was like really in vogue. Like you was walking around, people like giving you hugs, white folks apologizing to you, handing you candy,
people saying hi while I'm jogging. Yeah, hey.
Or people open the door for you. I'm so sorry. It's like, what in the world is going on? And since then, my bad. They painted some streets with Black Lives Matter, and they almost put Harriet Tubman on some money, and a lot of things have happened. And we saw a rise in really conscious language. And one of those, and not to say this language was not present before, that's not honest. This language has been present for several decades, but we started seeing more and more people talk about the concept of anti-racism. It's not enough to not be racist, you need to be anti-racist. And then there's a lot of content that started coming up around what does it look like to make an anti-racist workforce or to have an anti-racist leadership. I'm curious, like when you consider the term anti-racism, Dana, what comes to mind for you?
Well, thank you so much for having me on, and thank you for the kind words. I'm just really, really happy to be here and to talk about this. I love this topic. So, what is anti-racism for me? For me, I love the simplicity of it. It's like we all learned in, I don't know what was it, 3rd, 4th grade, that anti is that prefix that means kind of against. And then there's racism, and it's, specifically actively, and I think that's a key word there, working against racism. And that's one of the concepts that Kendi talks about so brilliantly, was that part of the problem is too many of us, and I'll include myself in that, have certainly not been a supporter of racism, but that's not a high bar. It's really not a high bar at all. But the question is, well, what are you doing to actively work against it on a regular basis. It's like walking by that fire, that house that's on fire. Feeling bad is not a high bar. Wishing the house wasn't on fire, not a high bar. That just kind of makes you a decent human being. But where the change comes in is actually taking action. And, I love the fact that you said it's not a new concept. Those who've read Kendi's, work will know that he says he didn't create the term and, he wasn't the originator, and he talks about Angela Davis using it decades earlier. So not a new concept, but we just haven't taken that action. And so that's why I love the term, and that's where I choose to place most of my energy.
The idea of being like anti something, like to your point, like being against racism, like to me it would seem to it would intimate that there would need to be like specific actions taken to push back against the thing, right? So like when I think about anti-racism, I think about the idea of, okay, well, if you're anti-racist at work, then there are certain things that are happening that are racist at work, and then you're then taking action to be against those racist things. Like if you were to talk to me about or if you were to articulate further, like what does it mean to be anti-racist in action, like in the going ons of the workplace, like what are some things that come to mind for you?
Yeah, and I think that can look differently for different people. And the good news of it is it doesn't have to look like, I think some people get uncomfortable or they look at the anti-racism work that some people are doing, they think, well, that's not me. And my feeling is, well, that's okay. Do it your way, but just do something. And too many of us, I think, use, and I'm going to get to a couple of specific examples, but let me just kind of set it up this way. Too many of us, let's be honest, just don't have the courage to speak up, just don't have the courage. They're just going about their day. And some people have the privilege to not necessarily feel that they need to do something. And so I think that impacts behavior or lack of action or behavior as well. So, as I set this up, I also just want to be really clear that, the way it looks for me may not be the way it looks for you, or how or where you choose to lean in. But I'm just an advocate of doing something. So just one really super simple example that I posted on LinkedIn on Indigenous Peoples Day, which I don't know, a week ago or so. I'm just going about my day like everybody else. And this is the other thing. Yes, we need to do big things, or yes, you might see Ketanji Brown Jackson being, nominated or, joining the Supreme Court. Those are big, huge things, or LDF winning some major case. Those are big, huge things. But each of us can do small things, can do little things. And one of my favorite quotes is, I think it's Margaret Mead's, talking about that, all it takes is just a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens who can change the world. And that's the only thing that really ever has. But back to Indigenous Peoples Day. So I came back from a jog and, looked at my calendar, trying to figure out what I needed to do. And in bright red, I saw Columbus Day. And that shouldn't seem surprising, I guess. But to me, in this state of, as you teed it up, we're supposed to be so conscious now. We're supposed to be so, considerate. And I just thought, how can we still on our calendars, how can these publishers still be calling this Columbus Day with everything that's known, knowing the impact that likely has on Indigenous people and their communities and on all of us. And so I said, I'm not buying this calendar anymore. Who makes this calendar? Let me go. We've got the Googler now. I didn't have that growing up, and now it's super easy. I feel like there are no excuses. So I hop on the Googler, say who makes this, and find out it was an at-a-glance calendar. And I found that they were, there's a company, I think the company is Acro or ACO. It's a $2 billion company that manages multiple brands. And I just posted on LinkedIn and I'm, hey, in 2022, this is not okay. And I really would like to know what your plan is for doing this differently moving forward. This really is not okay. I'm thinking about all the, it's a $2 billion company. It's a lot of people. I'm thinking, what about all the people who work there? How does that make them feel, knowing that this is what's being put out? And so I put that out there, not because I expected, not because I expect them to call me up and say, oh, okay, thanks for letting us know. We're going to go change it. But as an example, like, hey, everybody, this is a tiny, tiny thing. It literally took me 10 minutes to do this. What is something that, we all could be doing, and myself included, on a regular basis? Because I get that question all the time. Like, how do you move beyond book clubs, and how do you move beyond feeling bad? Well, small actions like that, that's how you move beyond it. I know it might not sound terribly sexy, or it didn't go viral or anything like that, but you don't know the impact that pressure, that small pressure, when all of us are creating small bits of pressure, it makes a difference.
One, thank you for this incredible answer. My follow-up to that is, do you believe that the weight of anti-racist action is the same between Black folks and majority/white folks?
I thought you were going to ask me a different question. So
give me the question. Answer
you were starting.
Answer the question you thought I was going to ask you.
Okay, so what I thought you were going to ask is people of color. When you said Black folks, I thought you were going to go to, is it different for Black folks versus people of color? And the answer for me is certainly not necessarily, and oftentimes not. And I think that that's evidenced, not to say, so, let me be clear. Racism and oppression comes in many forms, and there are many racial groups that have been oppressed since the beginning of time. It's not unique to Black people, certainly, or indigenous people, certainly. I mean, the Chinese Exclusion Act was real. I mean, so we know that this has happened, that many racial groups have been victimized and marginalized. So it's not to minimize that in any way. But I think that the recent example that we had with the Los Angeles City Council president who, was forced to resign, a woman who herself was a woman of color, but still found it appropriate to use racist, anti-Black tropes. So one of the dangers that we have is painting with a really broad brush and assuming that anybody who's not white has the same experience.
Oh, that's 1,000%, right? I think and the thing about it is, we can look at just a bunch of data across the world and see that anti-Blackness is a global phenomenon, right? It's a unique point of oppression across the world.
It's global, it's distinct, and it has a unique history. I mean, yes, Cameron Diaz and Viola Davis might both technically be women of color, but you can't tell me that Hollywood views them the same and they're going to, experience the same level of oppression.
100%, right? And I think so there's, I've always had I've always challenged, I had issue with even the term people of color and BIPOC, because I believe there's a level of erasure there. And frankly, I think there's a level of anti-Blackness there. And so I appreciate that answer. And I do believe it's a nuanced, it's not as nuanced as people, because a lot of people say, Dana, but a lot of people say this is a nuanced conversation to kind of get away from just having uncomfortable dialogue. So it's nuanced. It's not that nuanced, but it is a nuanced conversation regarding the points of solidarity and difference in non-white communities and space and cultures. I do want to go back to my other question, though, of what does it look like to challenge white folks as it pertains to anti-racism? And I ask this question because just in every measurable facet, Dana, from health, comorbidities and wealth accumulation and education access and acceleration, career acceleration, to unemployment, to food access, to housing access, to financial loans, like every aspect. White folks have an exponential advantage and baked into the very fabric of the way that we operate as a colonized society, Western society, particularly where you and I have this conversation in America. And so I want to talk about white folks, and what their accountability is, because I'll put my cards on the table. I do think they have an outsized accountability when it comes to anti-racism, because they have so much more power baked into the very fabric of how we exist. And so I'm curious, like, what's your position on that? And like, what does it look like if you agree? And then if you do agree, what does it look like to drive accountability and engagement for them to be anti-racist?
Yeah, that's a big question. And I think I'm largely in agreement with you. When you were talking, one of the quotes that I saw on LinkedIn, and I wish I could attribute it to someone because it's not mine, but for me, it really, really cut to the core from a Black-white perspective. And the quote was, "White supremacy won't end until white people begin to see it as a white problem that they need to fix instead of a Black problem that they need to empathize with." And for me, that kind of said it all. And it's not in any way to say, hey, this is your stuff, we don't want to have anything to do with it. Because I'm a believer in, unfortunately, we're in such a bad shape. It's like racism is a multi-lane highway. Pick your lane and just keep your foot on the gas. So I'm a believer in, yes, we all need to be working towards it. But clearly, this is a problem that was created historically within the white community. And there's a lot of work and accountability that needs to be done there. And so that's why, sometimes there's this debate about white people, participating and they shouldn't participate, whatever. I'm a big proponent of them participating because I think they need to have a whole lot of accountability, And, but before you can even have the accountability, you need to acknowledge, and you need to, we got to get past, this, I think about doing my daughter's hair the other day, and it was all kind of, it was a little ornery there, and I wanted to take the time to comb it through, and she didn't want me to comb it through. So we were rushing. So I was like, okay, let me just slap some stuff, just make it kind of look good on the outside. But I know inside it's a bird's nest. And so I need to, still comb it through. And I think that's what we've kind of done as a broader society. It's like on the outside, it looks, it looks nice. I mean, we got Obama and you look like you're doing well and, all this stuff. But we still know we can look at the outcomes. I live in Georgia, and I'm sitting right now 5 minutes from Raphael Warnock's church. I live around the corner from Martin Luther King's birth home, and we've never, ever, for those data nerds, let's be clear, ever had a Black female governor in this country. 0. Okay, try to finagle that number. 0. So why would that be? To me, there are only 2 major buckets of reasoning to get you to why we've never elected a Black female governor in this particular case. But certainly we could cite tons of statistics. We could look at the Fortune 500 CEOs. We could look at disparities in household wealth. I mean, there's just tons of statistics that we could look at. To me, either there's something deficient in the capacity inherently of Black women, or there's something wrong with the process. There is something in the system that is overrepresenting males, in particular, white people, in particular, white males. Or, so it's one of those 2. You kind of can't have it. It's not an accident. Statistically, there's no way it could be an accident.
That there's been 0.
That has been 0. And there are other zeros that we could talk about. So I'm saying, yes, accountability is critical. But what I find, the barrier, the barrier that precedes that is just the simple acknowledgement that there has been, white people have been overrepresented in wealth and health and financial security, and all these other areas. So absolutely, I would agree that needs to happen. And that's one of the reasons why I tend to try to focus on facts, like try not to argue the emotion of it, but try to focus on the facts. So when people, try to deny that, well, why do you think that would be? So if Black wealth, median household wealth is 10% of white wealth, why do you think that would be? Because they've got to give one of two answers. Either an answer that sounds kind of racist because there's something inherent in Black people, or something that acknowledges the systemic racism that obviously has been cultivated. It didn't happen overnight, cultivated over hundreds of years.
And it's interesting because like you said something earlier about like some of us just don't have the courage to speak up and like really, and here's the thing, like I try not to, and it's not, I don't do a good job of it consistently, Dana, but I try not to hold it against Black folks who choose not to shake the table or rattle or say something when they think something is wrong, because we have to survive. We live in a capitalist society. You need money to live. And the data's been proven that Black folks are often, when it comes to layoffs and even just retaliatory behaviors or increased performance management or performance improvement plans, Black folks are on the short end of the stick on all those different things. So I'm not going to shame. I try not to wag my finger or shake my head too hard when people just say, hey, I think that's wrong, but I have a family, I gotta survive, whatever. My only caveat to that is when Black folks do step on other Black folks to then advance and move around. And that's the part. And again, like there's history there as well. Like we had Dr. Caitlin Rosenthal on, who wrote this book called Accounting for Slavery. And we talked about like even just the history, the meta narrative of Black folks being delegated to manage other Black folks and keep them in line. And so I do believe we see that phenomena carry forward in corporate America. All that said is I don't think it's fair I don't think it's fair to say white people can't participate. They absolutely need to be participating in anti-racism. And then two, it's not fair to expect for Black folks and brown people now more broadly to do all the labor, because we don't even have the power to drive real systemic change because we're not in the positions to do that. So continuing forward, when I think about anti-racism, I just said the word, so I kind of gave myself away, but power redistribution, right? You think about like organizational equity, you think about decision-making. Ultimately, those things come down to power. Like how many, in your research, in your work, in the work that you lead, and in the discussions that you facilitate, Dana, and the work that with the clients also that you work with and consult, how often does like power as a concept come up when it comes to like the concept of anti-racism?
Well, I think it's really important. I think it's fundamental. I think that it is it's scary to think about the fact that the reality is, as you've said, this certainly is not something that first minoritized communities or historically marginalized communities should be expected to fix. Again, we didn't create this. Should be expected to fix on their own. And in many spaces and in many situations and circumstances, we don't have the power because historically, white people, more specifically white men, have been overrepresented in powerful positions or decision-making positions, etc. So I think that power issue is really important. I would like to go back to the comment that you made before about not holding Black people, not holding Black people accountable, but I do think that's a very complicated, nuanced topic, and I can just offer my thoughts there, because I understand the pushback in terms of, we all have to feed our families, and we know that we know that we work in spaces where there may be consequences for speaking up and speaking out. And I get that. And that's why I so hammer home the point of feel free to do it in your way. Okay. You know, your speaking out does not necessarily mean that you're picketing in front of the, in front of the company, or, you're firing off, you're ranting to the CEO, or you're rolling around the floor, foaming at the mouth. I think people sometimes always go to the extreme. Okay. That doesn't necessarily have to be your tactic. Maybe you have a different way of doing it. Maybe you have access to certain data, or maybe there's just other ways. I mean, you might have a different style. You might have a particular subject matter expertise. There are different ways to do it. I have more of a frustration with people who use that as an excuse for doing nothing.
That's a bar. That's real. That's real.
Yeah, and again, a lot of this to me goes back to the history. When you look back historically, I just always go to, where would we be if 50 years they all wanted to keep quiet and not do anything? Not to mention the fact that they had so much less, and they were willing to risk so much more. Even though I can understand, I don't want my major clients to, fire me tomorrow. I don't want my husband to get laid off. I mean, I get that. But when I think about the difference that it's going to make in our lifestyle, for many of us, we're not willing to, go without cable for 2 weeks. It's like, but when they did the bus boycott,
they
boycotted for over a year. They were, like you said, they walked. They were willing. And most of them were going to jobs cleaning houses. So it's not like they had 6 figures in the bank and 401k and a SEP IRA, and they didn't have any of that. But they were willing to sacrifice almost everything. And they were. I mean, their houses were getting bombed, and they were sending their kids out.
There's a lack of, so some of that though, oh man. Oh, Dana, we about to have a podcast now. See, some of that though comes down to, and for greater context, of course, like not all the black folks were even pro King. A lot of them liked what they had and didn't want to give it up.
That's true.
But to your point though, like there was a level of organization that black folks in that era were willing to engage in, communal organization and sharing. But I think though, what I often see, and what I've experienced firsthand, is that a lot of black folks, especially like in corporate tie spaces, when they reach a certain level, Dana, they don't really want to be black no more, right? And I think like not in the ways that are tangible and helpful to their community. They really want to be white or white adjacent as it pertains. They don't want to coordinate, and they don't want to sacrifice, and they don't want to give. Not in any context that would threaten, to your point, your 401k. You said some other thing. I don't even know what you're talking about. Say it again. 401ks.
The SEP IRA.
SEP IRA. What is
the SEP IRA? Just because I left corporate 20 years ago.
Let me look up SEP IRA.
The SEP IRA.
Every time you've been noticing, I've been looking down. I'm over here like, what is he talking about? Oh, simplified employee pension plan. Oh yeah, that sounds
right. It's for entrepreneurs.
Okay, well let me click on that. I'm gonna bookmark that later. So here's the thing. I do think too that like, when you think about how corporate America has shifted and changed, especially as we've like integrated as a society, right? Like we, black and brown people, have been presented with this carrot of like, hey, you can be a part of us. You can be one of us. You can have a seat at this table. You'll be the only one at the table, and it'll be a kiddie seat. And we're going to give you a kid's menu, but you can sit here. And, I think that's the one of the challenges, right? Where you think back in the day, 50 years ago, black folk, yes, there were black executives back then, but it was literally like 5 black people, right? Like it was virtually, that didn't happen. That didn't exist. So it was easier to practice solidarity and community because we were all that we had. Whereas today, I think a lot of us, we buy into this illusion that we're somehow different, we're somehow special, and that we're not like the other black folks. We're such and such because we got this degree, we got this certification, and we work at this bank or this company that could lay us off today, but we work here, so it's different. So all that being said, I want to get back to, let's talk a little bit about, the landscape of DEI today. You talked, and you talked a little bit about the lack of black women governors in Georgia. I'm actually from Rome, Georgia, by the way. Yeah, I'm up the street, you know what I'm saying? Like a couple hours away, not too far. But it's interesting. As I look at this landscape, I see an increasingly right-leaning political space, right? I think everything is pushing that way. There's narratives in the mainstream media around the fact that this foregone conclusion that the GOP is going to take over the House and the Senate. You got Trump alluding to running again if he don't go to jail. He ain't gonna go to jail. But we're also then seeing DEI teams again being let go. We're seeing budgets continue to shrink as we pair that with economic anxieties around just what a potential recession looks like in 2023. There's a lot of things going on. What is your prospects as you look at diversity, equity, inclusion, the work that you do, the work that a lot of folks are doing out here to create equitable cultures? Where do you see that going in the next couple years?
So first, I need to step back again to clarify, provide context, because I view DEI and workplace anti-racism is pretty different. And so I just want to give that context first. And I think that too often what happens is they're so conflated. They're kind of viewed as one and the same. And I would argue that that's one of the reasons why we've made so little progress, specifically related to racism, anti-Black racism in particular, over the past several decades, is that most organizations have DEI. Most of them have a requirement that the organization exists, not necessarily that it be impactful or that there be specific outcomes, but just that, there's an existence. Sometimes that's one person, sometimes that's a group of people. I think that that's really important work, but I think that unfortunately what's happened over time, because of course DEI is looking at a range of differences, both visible and invisible. In fact, most of them are probably invisible. That's a really, really broad umbrella. And every year it just seems to get broader and broader and broader and broader. And I'll just share just a super quick anecdote. I remember back when I was still in corporate, and again, this is 20 years ago, and I attended a DEI session, and a white woman was leading the session, and she really started with this, emphasizing the point that, DEI is not just race and gender. It is so much more. And then she proceeded for the rest of the workshop to talk about and focus on everything except race and gender. And it's not to say that those other areas aren't important, because they are. And everyone, people can be marginalized for a range of reasons. And we truly do want to create inclusive work environments. And that means everybody, whether you feel marginalized because of your learning style or your sexual orientation or for whatever, for your parental status, for your marital status, your age. These are all legitimate, important areas to explore. But what I've found is there's a beauty in having that broad umbrella, But there's also a real danger and a real risk with how that breath can be used, because let's keep it real, too many organizations are choosing to ignore, are choosing to use that breath to hide under. That umbrella becomes a hiding spot. Because you know what? A, B, C, and D, if A is racism and, B is anti-Blackness, I'm going to start with C and just keep on going. One, because I may not be competent to speak on it. Or two, I just may be uncomfortable. I'd much rather, the white woman who was standing leading my workshop, she didn't want to talk about racism. She didn't want to talk about Blackness. She wasn't comfortable talking about that stuff. So she had like 20 other things she could pick from. So she, spun that roulette wheel and just decided to pick something else. So for me, again, if we look at the outcomes, we look at the number of Black CEOs in the Fortune 500, or you look at the number of Black people sitting on corporate boards or in executive positions in IT firms. There's so many different metrics you can choose from. But if you look at the fact that DEI is not new. I mean, DEI has been around, since I think officially it started with the Kennedy executive order in the 50s. And, it's really been around since 70s, 80s for sure, in many organizations. But when you look at the data, the metrics, why has the plight of Black professionals not been enhanced dramatically over that time? And I would argue that DEI has, while I think it's been helpful in many spaces, it is not the panacea. It has not been the fix necessarily for anti-Black racism in particular. So I'm a big believer in both and. I think we need DEI. We need to focus on creating, broad, inclusive workplaces where everyone can feel valued. But if we're really trying to be serious about fixing systemic racism, we got to get in there and address it and attack it as a specific business imperative and as a specific challenge, a specific problem, not just append it to DEI and think that, every February, we can just have a couple lunch and learns to celebrate a Heritage Month and think that somehow is going to ameliorate centuries of systemic racism. It's not going to do it. To me, it's almost like when COVID hit. The CDC, yes, they care about a broad range of diseases and they're all important and they all require attention. But guess what? When COVID hit, they said, oh, guess what? We still gotta do that other stuff, but we have to specifically gather resources and focus on this pandemic and develop some very specific solutions to address this very specific harm. And that's what I see most workplaces don't do and probably won't continue to do in the future until and unless there is some recognition or some pressure to that end.
It's interesting, like to that point, like, I've been having conversations around the fact that, like, I think diversity, equity, inclusion as it's most commonly presented and pushed is really a scam. Like it's largely positioned to benefit everybody but Black folks. Like, and oftentimes, we're just kind of starting to see some narrative and language and focus around Black women, kinda. But like historically, it's really been a space where I've seen white women really accelerate their careers. Like it sounds as if to me, though, your position is that anti-Blackness in that work is much more for the this is gonna, not to trigger anybody, but this is like more activist. It's a much more like pointed, forward-facing work than corporatized diversity, equity, inclusion work. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that for me, it just comes down to the fact that DEI is a very broad umbrella. It's focused on creating inclusive environments, and that covers a lot of communities. That covers probably 12, 15, 20 different communities. And unfortunately, the irony is because much of this work is done in workplaces and spaces that are somewhat anti-Black and are hostile and do have systemic racism, they're not really motivated to focus on racism. And I think that's kind of a no-brainer. And so even though technically it should be, one of those communities, I find it's not prominently represented. I find it's not sufficiently represented. And another example, for example, I do think life experience makes a huge difference. Life experience and education. I don't think just because you're a Black person, you're an authority. But I do think life experience makes a difference. And this is, another example. Like, I get requests all the time to talk about DEI, and I am very clear. In fact, there's a bio. I have a separate bio because I am not a DEI expert. I am a workplace anti-racism thought leader. And I'm very specific about that for a number of reasons. But one of the reasons too is I recognize that I just am not knowledgeable. I'm not the right person. If you want to have a broader DEI conversation, and let's say, for example, we want to deal with, gender identity issues, sexual orientation issues. Okay, now I'm a student. I'm not a teacher. Okay. And I respect those spaces enough to acknowledge the fact that I'm not the appropriate person because I just don't have the knowledge, I don't have the life experience, and that's required to handle that competently and to handle that responsibly. So I just think that they're two different things, almost like healthcare and cardiology. Okay, just because, I'm not going to ask my dermatologist to be my marriage counselor. Those are just two different things. And we try to pretend we have, it's all, we just try to think, this person works in DEI. Not to mention the fact that DEI almost always is part of HR. And a lot of times, again, when you focus on rooting out systemic racism, a lot of the causes, a lot of the potential solutions, a lot of the issues are going to be, you're going to find them in marketing. You're going to find them in R&D, product development, medicine, law. You're going to find it in those line organizations where people are actually doing the work, not necessarily in HR. So like my husband's a physician, and so he's always talked to me about how racism shows up from a clinical perspective. And I've worked with a lot of other doctors, and I, just wrote an article about the maternal mortality crisis and how that impacts Black and Brown communities more significantly. COVID, another great example, is the HR person, and it's not in any way to, demean, to HR. And I'm not trying to do that at all. But I'm saying if we're trying to get really clear in terms of, okay, this process is broken, and this process, the way it's contrived, discriminates, against certain people or advantages certain people. It's the people who are using the process day in and day out who are in a position to see that. Again, using my husband's example, he tells me about the things that are happening, but they're happening in a clinical setting. The person who's sitting in corporate HR is not going to know that, is not going to be able to take action on that or make a suggestion or say this isn't working or this isn't right. So those are some of the reasons why I feel that, one, they're just two different things. And two, they're not working to benefit many Black professionals as well as they could, and certainly not as they purport to be, because you can, again, look on the surface and we have the team or the chief diversity officer. A lot of it looks good on the surface, but I just always drive people to the metrics. What do the metrics look like? And even there, you have to be careful because, we could, sprinkle some chocolate chips in there and make things look a little better on the surface. And again, as we all know, diversity doesn't necessarily mean inclusion. So.
Come on, Dana. Come on, now you dropping all the bars. This is why I want to have you on the show. See, thank you so much for being a guest. I know we consider you a friend of the show. It's funny. I had this joke, but the timing is off, but I'm going to say it anyway. So it's funny because you was talking about Black History Month, but now we got Juneteenth too. So,
right.
You know what I'm saying?
Oh yeah, two.
I mean, watermelon chicken sandwiches for everybody. And then we can just keep it moving. I think like that's really where you're absolutely right. They're two different things. I appreciate you coming on the show to talk about this space and this work. And I appreciate your pushback on the idea that everyone has accountability to do something, right? Everyone doesn't have to create a media network that centers and empowers Black and brown folks' work. Everybody doesn't have to be a several times published writer featured in a bunch of different major publications. Like everyone doesn't have to rail or picket outside, but everybody can do something to push for anti-race. So that makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, and I think, and I always put myself in there. Like I could do more, and I think it's hard to an extent because I think the natural inertia. It's not because you like racism. It's just because you're going about your day, and I gotta feed the dog, and I gotta, I've registered my daughter for her SSAT class, and it's just. It's too easy to do nothing. Doing nothing is so enticing because it's just so much easier. And it's, lazier. But I just call us to do more. And, we can unpack that even more. I do think also people negative fantasize too much. I think that people are too quick to go to the worst case scenario. It's like speaking up in a meeting, chances are you're not going to get fired tomorrow. But I think that also becomes an easy out. It's like you automatically mentally go to the absolute worst case scenario and assume that that's going to happen every single time. And it's not. I do think it's okay to be strategic. Just like you should be strategic with everything else. Ask yourself, is this the hill I'm willing to die on? Or be strategic in terms of, okay, there are 5 things I could push back about. Decide which one is the one I'm going to choose this time. Am I the right messenger? Like I might choose not necessarily out of lack of courage, but I'm more so being strategic because I realize I'm not really the best person to push on this. Maybe somebody else would be in a better position. I don't think I would be as successful as somebody else might be. So there's nothing wrong with being strategic and saying, maybe it's not the right time. I'm not the right messenger, or this isn't the right way to do it. I need to come back 2 months from now once I have more data and do it this way and, enlist some support and someone else maybe who's had similar experiences. So there's nothing wrong with being strategic or doing it your way. But I just think that doing nothing is what too many of us do too often. And that's not going to get us where we need to go. And I feel like we owe it to our kids. I absolutely feel like we owe it to our kids.
Dana, I mean, I don't know if we can really end it better than that. This has been a phenomenal conversation. Thank you so much for coming on Living Corporate.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. Excited about this conversation. Now, look, you're always writing something. You're always building and working on something. What would you like to, what should people be looking out for? What are you excited about? Like, what can we make sure that we promote before you get up out of here?
Well, if you want to connect with me, please follow me on LinkedIn or on my Forbes page. I mean, that's where I'm speaking most often, and that's where I'm posting. This morning, I just posted an article about this amazing man from Sierra Leone, but he lives here, named Mohammed Kamara. And he lost his sister and his aunt in the same month in 2017 to pregnancy-related complications. And that motivated him to create a virtual gynecology telehealth platform, specifically targeted to Black and brown women. And I just think he's just an amazing example. He's 30 years old, I think, around at the time. And it would have been much safer for him to just keep doing his corporate finance gig. I mean, he was doing great, but he really wanted to tackle this problem. And he's now been supported by Medscape and Google and just done some really amazing things. So yeah, follow me on LinkedIn and Forbes. And I just trying to do my part. And I love interacting with similarly minded individuals. So thanks again for having me.
It was an honor, Dana. Hope to talk to you soon.
Yes, would love to.
Peace. And we're back. Yo, shout out to Dana Brownlee. Listen, I want y'all to understand that anti-racism is not just an attitude, it's an action, right? It's a series of actions that you execute on a day-to-day, minute-by-minute basis, right? It's not just jargon and rhetoric. It's a certain level of personal accountability you take on. That's right, whoever's listening to this, you take on to make a more equitable world. I fully and wholeheartedly 100% believe that white professionals, white executives, white leadership have a responsibility in this season to lead anti-racism efforts. I also believe, and I agree with Dana Brownlee, that everyone has something that they can do. Everyone doesn't have to build a living corporate. Everyone doesn't have to be a Forbes senior contributor. Everyone doesn't have to write, you know what I'm saying, like a bunch of best-selling books. Shout out to Minda Harts. But everyone has something they can do. Everyone has something they can contribute. It doesn't have to look like everybody else, but it has to be something. That's right. Has to be something, right? For anti-racism to really happen, we all have to lift up and do something. And as I say that, again, the bulk of responsibility for creating anti-racist movements, anti-racist cultures, anti-racist environments are those who wield the most power. And those who wield the most power are white executives. Okay? That's right. So I'm not going to act like we're all equal in our responsibility, because we all don't have equal amounts of power, right? With great power comes great responsibility. Shout out Spider-Man. You know what I'm saying? Well, really shout out to Uncle Ben, right? I mean, he was the one who dropped that gem. And I mean, you know, y'all might think it's always just a comic book, but I'm saying that was a bar. That was a bar, right? Your responsibility is correlates with the power that you have. That's just, I mean, come on, like that's just good wisdom right there. Shout out to Stan Lee, to be honest. Anywho, listen, I appreciate you. You're listening to me record this conversation. We're coming up on Thanksgiving. I hope that you're taking the time that you need, especially in this season where tech organizations are laying folks off left and right and then hiring folks right back and trying to bring on contractors and just to use them and kick them to the curb. I mean, as we're looking at Twitter completely evaporate in front of our eyes, I hope that you're taking the time that you need for you. I hope this season reminds you that you matter to you, right? You matter to you. You might matter to other folks for a season or as long as you are giving them what they want, but you ultimately need to matter to you. All right. So take care of yourself. Make sure you give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. Tell a friend about us. Tell a coworker about us. Tell your racist supervisor about us too, especially this episode. I mean, it's a great episode. It's about anti-racism. You know, maybe it's gonna be like good education for them. You know what I mean? That way you don't have to educate them. You can just be like, yo, here's a link. I'm just share it with them. You know what I mean? All right. I love y'all. Peace.
Living Corporate is a podcast by Living Corporate LLC. Our logo was designed by David Dawkins. Our theme music was produced by Ken Brown. Additional music production by Antoine Franklin for Musical Elevation. Post-production is handled by Jeremy Jackson. Got a topic suggestion? Email us at livingcorporatepodcast@gmail.com. You can find us online on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and living-corporate.com. Thanks for listening. Stay tuned.